The Twilight Saga is mid. Not great, not terrible, just mid. That's my take on it. I know that a lot of people are going to be upset at me for saying this, whether tryhards or complete haters, but I really have to say that Twilight is mid, and I have to stand by that position. Now, a couple disclaimers before we move on. I binge-watched all 5 Twilight Saga movies over the week of February 9th through 15th. Twilight on Monday the 10th, New Moon on Tuesday the 11th, Eclipse on Wednesday the 12th, Breaking Dawn Part 1 on Thursday the 13th, and Breaking Dawn Part 2 on Friday the 14th. I have not read the books, I have only seen the movies. Any book-only information in this review was derived from secondary sources, such as TV tropes, reviews by other YouTubers, and a few fanfics. I acknowledge that Stephenie Meyer's target audience consists of female young adults and Mormons, the latter being because the author of the Twilight Saga, Stephenie Meyer, is herself Mormon. I am straight, white, male, and Catholic, and I acknowledge that I'm outside the target audience. But even then, I still have to think that the Twilight Saga is mid. Now, for a basic summary of the series. In Twilight, a human woman named Bella Swan falls in love with a vampire named Edward Cullen. Bella is then attacked by a pair of nomadic vampire serial killers, James and Victoria, and Edward has to fend them off. In New Moon, Edward moves away, causing Bella to become depressed, after which she latches onto her childhood friend, a werewolf named Jacob Black. Bella then has to go to Italy to prevent Edward from committing suicide by cop at the hands of the world's vampire government, the Volturi. In Eclipse, Victoria decides to start turning dozens of people into vampires, and then invades Bella's hometown with her little army, intending to murder Bella. The Cullens and the werewolves then have to tag team Victoria and her army, despite them being rivals. In Breaking Dawn, after marrying Edward, Bella gets pregnant and gives birth to a half-human, half-vampire baby before turning into a vampire herself. She then has to prove to the Volturi that her daughter Renesmee is not an immortal child, a kid turned into a vampire, which in the Twilight Saga is very bad news, and they were banned for a reason. Is the Twilight Saga overrated? Yes. Does it have genuinely problematic content, like offensive stereotypes about Native Americans, offensive stereotypes about Catholics, cultural misappropriation, condoning physically and mentally abusive behavior towards romantic and sexual partners? Yes. Can I understand why people hate it? Yes. Does it have moments that are genuinely relatable, especially for people on the autism spectrum? Also, yes. Does it have moments that are genuinely amusing or funny? Also, yes. Can I understand why certain people would like it, such as its female, millennial target audience, Mormons, or Shadiversity of all people? Yes. Have I seen movies significantly worse than Twilight Saga? Yes. Are there fanfics that I like better than canon? Yes. The premise of a woman loving a vampire is rather intriguing. I've seen other stories with that basic premise, and I've toyed with the idea myself in my own fiction writing. The world building is decent, excluding the content that is problematic or aggressively Mormon. The real place where Stephenie Meyer dropped the ball was in the execution. And to provide some evidence of that, I have seen Twilight fanfics based on story ideas derived from Meyer's world building that are much more interesting than what Stephenie Meyer herself had written. In terms of the overall feel of the Twilight Saga, I'd basically describe it as paranormal romance for Hallmark fans. You'd probably like it if you were a fan of sappy Hallmark movies. The movies are stupid, but they're a fun kind of stupid. But they have, for lack of a better term, odd mood swings. One scene is a sappy Hallmark-style romance, another will be wacky and comedic, a third will be a dark action thriller, and a fourth will be too relatable and hit too close to home. Another thing showing that the execution is where the ball was dropped. Certain themes that would be expected because of certain characters' backstories seem to be ignored. And the Cullens seem a lot less dysfunctional than they should be. For example, Jasper Hale, one of the Cullens, is explicitly stated to be a Confederate Army veteran from the American Civil War who was kidnapped and turned into a vampire by a coven of Mexican vampires who used him to train armies of their own. But at no point does Jasper show that many signs of PTSD, either from the war or from serving with the Mexican vampires. And Rosalie, meanwhile, Rosalie Hale, another Cullen, is explicitly a fan, or Rosalie is explicitly a victim of domestic violence, and she seems to have a lot less PTSD than would be expected from someone who went through what she did. Her traumatic experiences are mentioned precisely once in the context of why Bella shouldn't rush to become a vampire. And yet, for some reason, I think that would have been relevant much sooner. Because Rosalie would have, or should have, picked up on the red flags in Edward and Bella's relationship and tried to keep Bella from getting hurt the way she was hurt, the way Rosalie was hurt. Regarding my previous statement of the Twilight Saga being stupid, but a fun kind of stupid. In Twilight, Victoria is seen wearing a green "Kiss Me, I'm Irish" shirt, and I think it's kind of funny to see a vampire wearing a shirt that says "Kiss Me, I'm Irish." in New Moon, there's a scene where the werewolf alpha, Sam, his wife, Emily, is shown baking muffins for him and the boys. Muffins here, muffin here, muffin here. And the sheer enthusiasm over these muffins was really amusing. Like, if you want to get on a werewolf's good side, you bake them muffins. That's what you do. Now, on the previous slide, I mentioned Rosalie having been a victim of domestic violence. That same backstory mentions that she ended up taking revenge by dressing up in a wedding dress, killing her abusive fiancé and all of his friends, saving him for last, and elsewhere I've basically described her as being Vampire Kill Bill. And yeah, the whole Vampire Kill Bill thing that Rosalie had going on was kind of hilarious and amusing, but it's also the reason why I'm disappointed that Rosalie didn't step in to protect Bella from all of the red flags in her relationship with Edward. And then in Breaking Dawn, there's the best scene in the movie where Bella has just recovered from giving birth to a half-vampire baby. She's just turned into a vampire, and her attempt to reunite with her little baby is interrupted by finding out that, major spoilers, Jacob imprinted on the kid, and Bella goes all Mama Bear, kicking him out of the house. And then the part where she absolutely flips out is when she finds out that Jacob gave her daughter the affectionate nickname of Renesmee. And then she flips out going, "You nicknamed my daughter after the Loch Ness Monster?" Like, that scene has both dad on the first date energy and Mama Bear energy at the same time. So the best scenes in each of the movies. In Twilight, my favorite scene was when Bella first visits the Cullens' house and she meets Emmett the jock, Alice the psychic, Jasper the war vet, Rosalie, and Edward's adoptive mom, Esme. My favorite part in New Moon was when Bella meets the Quillette werewolves. Then there's a fight between Jacob and Paul, who've both wolfed out. And then the scene of Emily baking muffins for the other werewolves. That whole sequence was like, despite being meant to portray the werewolves as bad boys, it's so chaotic, and the mood swing between one scene you've got Jacob and Paul fighting each other into the woods, And then in the very next scene is Emily baking the muffins. My favorite scene in Eclipse was Rosalie's origin story, which unfortunately was a bit of a big-lipped alligator moment, brought up once, never mentioned again. And then, of course, for Breaking Dawn, Bella going full Mama Bear and attacking Jacob. Now for the worst moments in the Twilight Saga. For Twilight, Edward keeps very obviously trying to push Bella away, but unfortunately, he's too direct, and Bella ends up becoming much more attracted to him. For New Moon, I really didn't like the scenes of Bella hallucinating, Edward warning her not to do stupid stuff. For Eclipse, Rosalie's lack of interference regarding the red flags, because if she has PTSD, then she really should have intervened sooner. And then Breaking Dawn, the Cullens could have easily de-escalated by showing proof that Renesmee was not an immortal child, but they didn't. Now for the reason why I consider the Twilight Saga to be somewhat autistic. There are a lot of characters who seem rather neurodivergent-coded to me. Bella Swan, I think, is either autistic or ADHD, autistic and ADHD. Aside from her relationship with Edward, she's rather self-isolating and repulsed by other people's socialization. There are some scenes where she's arriving in Forks High School and these kids start mobbing her like she's the new popular girl, and Bella is quite clearly uncomfortable with being mobbed. The thing where she considers herself average looking, but everyone else acts like she's hot, seems like a sign of negative self-image. She also has a tendency to just do things without saying she's going to do so beforehand or talking about it beforehand. And the whole thing about Bella actively wanting to throw away her humanity and become a vampire sounds like the sort of Ubermensch fantasy that a lot of autistic people have as a way of coping with the BS and the abuse that neurotypicals often put them through. Bella's mom, Renee Dwyer, on the other hand, seems to be either ADHD or ADHD. If the way she's presented in both the movies and the books, scatterbrained, disorganized, and impulsive, that all sounds like Renee is either ADHD or ADHD. Edward himself, he comes across as autistic a couple of times, blunt, standoffish, more of a doing than a caring about optics or legality type of person. He just does it without saying anything. And apparently, the scene where he covers his hand when he first meets Bella in the science classroom, the way it's described sounds a lot like he's having a sensory overload at that moment. Rosalie Hale, I did mention before that she should have had more obvious signs of PTSD, but she also seemed autistic as well, because part of the reason why she ended up becoming a victim of domestic violence was because she had anxiety over nobody loving her unconditionally, which she decided to address by becoming a mom so that her kids would love her unconditionally. Alice, meanwhile, the psychic vampire and Bella's closest friend among the Cullens besides Edward, she has a lot of moments where she comes across as autistic or ADHD. And to be honest, the thing where she can see the future and then has to act to either fulfill it or prevent it sounds a lot like autistic people's tendency to see things that are going to happen based on evidence that they know, and then having to intervene to prevent something from going terribly wrong. With such a rather long list of autistic-coded characters, it makes me think that Stephenie Meyer herself is probably autistic or ADHD, because otherwise you wouldn't accidentally write so many neurodivergent-coded characters. And now, here's how I'd review each of the movies. Twilight, Eclipse, Breaking Dawn Part 1, and Breaking Dawn Part 2, I'd all give a rating of 5 out of 10. New Moon, the weakest film in the Twilight Saga, I'd give a 4 out of 10. And for reference, I have seen movies that are a lot worse than Twilight. The two worst movies I've ever seen, Tape 407 and Grandma Werewolf, I'd give only a 3 out of 10. This is Strategic Gaming with Acorn Soup. I have been Acorn Soup, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.